Chapter 3. The knowledge of this world. This world is a stage or marketplace passed by pilgrims on their way to the next. It is here that they are to provide themselves with provisions for the way. Or to put it plainly, man acquires here by the use of his bodily senses some knowledge of the works of God and through them of God himself, the sight of whom will constitute his future beatitude. It is for the acquirement of this knowledge that the spirit of man has descended into this world of water and clay. As long as his senses remain with him, he is said to be in this world. When they depart, and only his essential attributes remain, he is said to have gone to the next world. While man is in this world, two things are necessary for him. First, the protection and nurture of his soul. Secondly, the care and nurture of his body. The proper nourishment of the soul, as above shown, is the knowledge and love of God. And to be absorbed in the love of anything but God is the ruin of the soul. The body, so to speak, is simply the riding animal of the soul and perishes while the soul endures. The soul should take care of the body, just as a pilgrim on his way to Mecca takes care of his camel. But if the pilgrim spends his whole time in feeding and adorning his camel, the caravan will leave him behind, and he will perish in the desert. Man's bodily needs are simply being comprised under three heads: food, clothing, and a dwelling place. But the bodily desires which were implanted in him with a view to procuring these are apt to rebel against reason, which is of later growth than they. Accordingly, as we saw above, they require to be curbed and restrained by the divine laws promulgated by the prophets. Considering the world with which we have for a time to do, we find it divided into three departments: animal, vegetable, and mineral. The products of all three are continually needed by man, and have given rise to three principal occupations, those of the weaver, the builder, and the worker in metal. These, again, have many subordinate branches, such as tailors, masons, smiths, etc. None can be quite independent of others. This gives rise to various business connections and relations, and those too frequently afford occasions for hatred, envy, jealousy, and other maladies of the soul. Hence come quarrels and strife and the need of political and civil government and knowledge of law. Thus, the occupations and businesses of the world have become more and more complicated and troublesome, chiefly owing to the fact that men have forgotten that their real necessities are only three: clothing, food, and shelter, and that these exist only with the object of making the body a fit vehicle for the soul in its journey towards the next world. They have fallen into the same mistake as the pilgrim to Mecca mentioned above, who, forgetting the object of his pilgrimage and himself, should spend his whole time in feeding and adorning his camel. Unless a man maintains the strictest watch, he is certain to be fascinated and entangled by the world, which, as the prophet said, is a more potent sorcerer than Harut and Marut, two fallen angels. The deceitful character of the world comes out in the following ways. In the first place, it pretends that it will always remain with you, while, as a matter of fact, it is slipping away from you, moment by moment, and bidding you farewell like a shadow which seems stationary, but is actually always moving. Again, the world presents itself under the guise of a radiant but immoral sorceress, pretends to be in love with you, fondles you, and then goes off to your enemies, leaving you to die of chagrin and despair. Jesus, upon whom be peace, saw the world revealed in the form of an ugly old hag. He asked her how many husbands she had possessed. She replied that they were countless. He asked whether they had died or been divorced. She said that she had slain them all. "I marvel," he said, "at the fools who see what you have done to others and still desire you." This sorceress decks herself out in gorgeous and jeweled apparel and veils her face. Then she goes forth to seduce men, too many of whom follow her to their own destruction. The prophet has said that on the judgment day the world will appear in the form of a hideous witch with green eyes and projecting teeth. Men, beholding her, will say, "Mercy on us, who is this?" The angels will answer, "This is the world for whose sake you quarreled and fought and embittered one another's lives." Then she will be cast into hell, whence she will cry out, "O Lord, where are those, my former lovers?" God will then command that they be cast after her. Whoever will seriously contemplate the past eternity during which the world was not in existence and the future eternity during which it will not be in existence will see that it is essentially like a journey in which the stages are represented by years, the leagues by months, the miles by days, and the steps by moments. What words then can picture the folly of the man who endeavors to make it his permanent abode and forms plans 10 years ahead regarding things he may never need, seeing that very possibly he may be under the ground in 10 days? Those who have indulged without limit in the pleasures of the world at the time of death will be like a man who has gorged himself to repletion on delicious viands and then vomits them up. The deliciousness has gone, but the disgrace remains. The greater the abundance of the possessions which they have enjoyed in the shape of gardens, male and female slaves, gold, silver, etc., the more keenly they will feel the bitterness of parting from them. This is a bitterness which will outlast death, for the soul which has contracted covetousness as a fixed habit will necessarily in the next world suffer from the pangs of unsatisfied desire. Another dangerous property of worldly things is that they at first appear as more trifles, but each of these so-called trifles branches out into countless ramifications until they swallow up the whole of a man's time and energy. Jesus, on whom be peace, said, "The lover of the world is like a man drinking seawater. The more he drinks, the more thirsty he gets, till at last he perishes with thirst unquenched." The prophet said, "You can no more mix with the world without being contaminated by it than you can go into water without getting wet." The world is like a table spread for successive relays of guests who come and go. There are gold and silver dishes, abundance of food and perfumes. The wise guest eats as much as is sufficient for him, smells the perfumes, thanks his host, and departs. The foolish guest, on the other hand, tries to carry off some of the gold and silver dishes, only to find them wrenched out of his hands and himself thrust forth, disappointed and disgraced. We may close these illustrations of the deceitfulness of the world with the following short parable. Suppose a ship to arrive at a certain well-wooded island. The captain of the ship tells the passengers he will stop a few hours there and that they can go on shore for a short time, but warns them not to delay too long. Accordingly, the passengers disembark and stroll in different directions. The wisest, however, return after a short time and, finding the ship empty, choose the most comfortable places in it. A second band of the passengers spend a somewhat longer time on the island, admiring the foliage of the trees and listening to the song of the birds. Coming on board, they find the best places in the ship already occupied and have to content themselves with the less comfortable ones. A third party wander still farther and, finding some brilliantly colored stones, carry them back to the ship. Their lateness in coming on board compels them to stow themselves away in the lower parts of the ship, where they find their loads of stones, which by this time have lost all their brilliancy very much in their way. The last group go so far in their wanderings that they get quite out of reach of the captain's voice calling them to come on board, and at last he has to sail away without them. They wander about in a hopeless condition and finally either perish of hunger or fall a prey to wild beasts. The first group represents the faithful who keep aloof from the world altogether, and the last group the infidels who care only for this world and nothing for the next. The two intermediate classes are those who preserve their faith, but entangle themselves more or less with the vanities of things present. Although we have said so much against the world, it must be remembered that there are some things in the world which are not of it, such as knowledge and good deeds. A man carries what knowledge he possesses with him into the next world, and though his good deeds have passed, yet the effect of them remains in his character. Especially is this the case with acts of devotion, which result in the perpetual remembrance and love of God. These are among those good things which, as the Quran says, pass not away. Other good things there are in the world, such as marriage, food, clothing, etc., which a wise man uses just in proportion as they help him to attain to the next world. Other things which engross the mind, causing it to cleave to this world and to be careless of the next, are purely evil and were alluded to by the Prophet when he said, "The world is a curse, and all which is in it is a curse, except the remembrance of God and that which aids it." Chapter 4. The knowledge of the next world. As regards the joys of heaven, paradise, and the pains of hell which will follow this life, all believers in the Quran and the traditions are sufficiently informed. But it often escapes them that there is also a spiritual heaven and hell, concerning the former of which God said to his prophet, "Eye hath not seen nor ear heard, neither hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive the things which are prepared for the righteous." In the heart of the enlightened man there is a window opening on the realities of the spiritual world, so that he knows, not by hearsay or traditional belief, but by actual experience, what produces wretchedness or happiness in the soul just as clearly and decidedly as the physician knows what produces sickness or health in the body. He recognizes that knowledge of God and worship are medicinal, and that ignorance and sin are deadly poisons for the soul. Many even so-called learned men, from blindly following others' opinions, have no real certainty in their beliefs regarding the happiness or misery of souls in the next world. But he who will attend to the matter with a mind unbiased by prejudice will arrive at clear convictions on this matter. The effect of death on the composite nature of man is as follows. Man has two souls, an animal soul and a spiritual soul, which latter is of angelic nature. The seat of the animal soul is the heart, from which this soul issues like a subtle vapor and pervades all the members of the body, giving the power of sight to the eye, the power of hearing to the ear, and to every member the faculty of performing its own appropriate functions. It may be compared to a lamp carried about within a cottage, the light of which falls upon the walls wherever it goes. The heart is the wick of this lamp, and when the supply of oil is cut off for any reason, the lamp dies. Such is the death of the animal soul. With the spiritual or human soul, the case is different. It is indivisible, and by it man knows God. It is, so to speak, the rider of the animal soul. And when that perishes, it still remains, but is like a horseman who has been dismounted, or like a hunter who has lost his weapons. That steed and those weapons were granted the human soul, that by means of them it might pursue and capture the phoenix of the love and knowledge of God. If it has effected that capture, it is not a grief, but rather a relief, to be able to lay those weapons aside and to dismount from that weary steed. Therefore the prophet said, "Death is a welcome gift of God to the believer, but alas for that soul which loses its steed and hunting weapons before it has captured the prize. Its misery and regret will be indescribable." A little further consideration will show how entirely distinct the human soul is from the body and its members. Limb after limb may be paralyzed and cease working, but the individuality of the soul is unimpaired. Further, the body which you have now is no longer the body which you had as a child, but entirely different. Yet your personality now is identical with your personality then. It is therefore easy to conceive of it as persisting when the body is done with altogether, along with its essential attributes which were independent of the body, such as the knowledge and love of God. This is the meaning of that saying of the Quran, "The good things abide." But if instead of carrying away with you knowledge, you depart in ignorance of God, this ignorance also is an essential attribute, and will abide as darkness of soul and the seed of misery. Therefore the Quran says, "He who is blind in this life will be blind in the next life, and astray from the path." The reason of the human spirit seeking to return to that upper world is that its origin was from thence, and that it is of angelic nature. It was sent down into this lower sphere against its will to acquire knowledge and experience, as God said in the Quran, "Go down from hence, all of you. There will come to you instruction from me, and they who obey the instruction need not fear, neither shall they be grieved." The verse, "I breathed into man of my spirit," also points to the celestial origin of the human soul. Just as the health of the animal soul consists in the equilibrium of its component parts, and this equilibrium is restored when impaired by appropriate medicine, so the health of the human soul consists in a moral equilibrium which is maintained and repaired when needful by ethical instruction and moral precepts. As regards its future existence, we have already seen that the human soul is essentially independent of the body. All objections to its existence after death based on the supposed necessity of its recovering its former body fall, therefore, to the ground. Some theologians have supposed that the human soul is annihilated after death and then restored, but this is contrary both to reason and to the Quran. The former shows us that death does not destroy the essential individuality of a man, and the Quran says, "Think not that those who are slain in the path of God are dead. Nay, they are alive, rejoining in the presence of their Lord and in the grace bestowed on them." Not a word is said in the law about any of the dead, good or bad, being annihilated. Nay, the prophet is said to have questioned the spirits of slain infidels, as to whether they had found the punishments with which he had threatened them real or not. When his followers asked him what was the good of questioning them, he replied, "They hear my words better than you do." Some Sufis have had the unseen world of heaven and hell revealed to them when in a state of death-like trance. On their recovering consciousness, their faces betray the nature of the revelations they have had by marks of joy or terror. But no visions are necessary to prove what will occur to every thinking man, that when death has stripped him for his senses and left him nothing but his bare personality, if while on earth he has too closely attached himself to objects perceived by the senses, such as wives, children, wealth, lands, slaves, male and female, etc., he must necessarily suffer when bereft of those objects. Whereas on the contrary, if he has as far as possible turned his back on all earthly objects and fixed his supreme affection upon God, he will welcome death as a means of escape from worldly entanglements and of union with him whom he loves. In his case, the prophet's sayings will be verified. Death is a bridge which unites friend to friend, and the world is a paradise for infidels but a prison for the faithful. On the other hand, the pains which souls suffer after death all have their source in excessive love of the world. The prophet said that every unbeliever after death will be tormented by 99 snakes, each having 9 heads. Some simple-minded people have examined the unbelievers' graves and wondered at failing to see these snakes. They do not understand that these snakes have their abode within the unbeliever's spirit, and that they existed in him even before he died, for they were his own evil qualities symbolized, such as jealousy, hatred, hypocrisy, pride, deceit, etc., every one of which springs directly or remotely from love of the world. Such is the doom of those who, in the words of the Quran, set their hearts on this world rather than on the next. If those snakes were merely external, they might hope to escape their torment, if were but for a moment. But being their own inherent attributes, how can they escape? Take, for instance, the case of a man who has sold a slave girl without knowing how much he was attached to her till she is quite out of his reach. Then the love of her, hitherto dormant, wakes up in him with such intensity as to amount to torture, stinging him like a snake, so that he would fain cast himself into fire or water to escape it. Such is the effect of love of the world, which those who have it often suspect not till the world is taken from them, and then the torment of vain longing is such that they would gladly exchange it for any number of mere external snakes and scorpions. Every sinner thus carries with him into the world beyond death the instruments of his own punishment. And the Quran says truly, "Verily you shall see hell. You shall see it with the eye of certainty, and hell surrounds the unbelievers." It does not say we'll surround them, for it is round them even now. Some may object, if such is the case, then who can escape hell? For who is not more or less bound to the world by various ties of affection and interest? To this we answer that there are some, notably the fakirs, who have entirely disengaged themselves from love of the world. But even among those who have worldly possessions such as wife, children, houses, etc., there are those who, though they have some affection for these, love God yet more. Their case is like that of a man who, though he may have a dwelling which he is fond of in one city, when he is called by the king to take up a post of authority in another city, does so gladly as the post of authority is dearer to him than his former dwelling. Such are many of the prophets and saints. Others there are, and a great number, who have some love to God, but the love of the world so preponderates in them that they will have to suffer a good deal of pain after death before they are thoroughly weaned from it. Many profess to love God, but a man may easily test himself by watching which way the balance of his affection inclines when the commands of God come into collision with some of his desires. The profession of love to God, which is insufficient to restrain from disobedience to God, is a lie. We have seen above that one kind of spiritual hell is the forcible separation from worldly things to which the heart cleaves too fondly. Many carry about within them the germs of such a hell without being aware of it. Hereafter they will feel like some king who, after living in luxury, has been dethroned and made a laughing stock. The second kind of spiritual hell is that of shame, when a man wakes up to see the nature of the actions he committed in their naked reality. Thus he who slandered will see himself in the guise of a cannibal eating his dead brother's flesh, and he who envied as one who cast stones against a wall, which stones rebounding put out the eyes of his own children. This species of hell, that is, of shame, may be symbolized by the following short parable. Suppose a certain king has been celebrating his son's marriage. In the evening, the young man goes off with some companions and presently returns to the palace, as he thinks, intoxicated. He enters a chamber where a light is burning and lies down, as he supposes, by his bride. In the morning, when soberness returns, he is aghast to find himself in a mortuary of fire worshippers, his couch a bier, and the form which he mistook for that of his bride, the corpse of an old woman beginning to decay. On emerging from the mortuary with his garments all soiled, what is his shame to see his father, the king, approaching with a retinue of soldiers. Such is a feeble picture of the shame those will feel in the next world, who in this have greedily abandoned themselves to what they thought were delights. The third spiritual hell is that of disappointment and failure to reach the real objects of existence. Man was intended to mirror forth the light of the knowledge of God, but if he arrives in the next world with his soul thickly coated with the rust of sensual indulgence, he will entirely fail of the object for which he was made. His disappointment may be figured in the following way. Suppose a man is passing with some companions through a dark wood. Here and there, glimmering on the ground, lie variously coloured stones. His companions collect and carry these and advise him to do the same. For, say they, we have heard that these stones will fetch a high price in the place whither we are going. He, on the other hand, laughs at them and calls them fools for loading themselves in the vain hope of gain, while he walks free and unencumbered. Presently, they emerge into the full daylight and find that these coloured stones are rubies, emeralds, and other jewels of priceless value. The man's disappointment and chagrin at not having gathered some when so easily within his reach may be more easily imagined than described. Such will be the remorse of those hereafter who, while passing through this world, have been at no pains to acquire the jewels of virtue and the treasures of religion. This journey of man through the world may be divided into 4 stages: the sensuous, the experimental, the instinctive, and the rational. In the first, he is like a moth which, though it has sight, has no memory, and will singe itself again and again at the same candle. In the second stage, he is like a dog which, having once been beaten, will run away at the sight of a stick. In the third, he is like a horse or a sheep, both of which instinctively fly at the sight of a lion or a wolf, their natural enemies, while they will not fly from a camel or a buffalo, though these last are much greater in size. In the fourth stage, man altogether transcends the limits of the animals and becomes capable to some extent of foreseeing and providing for the future. His movements at first may be compared to ordinary walking on land, then to traversing the sea in a ship, then on the fourth plane, where he is conversant with realities, to walking on the sea, while beyond this plane there is a fifth known to the prophets and saints, whose progress may be compared to flying through the air. Thus man is capable of existing on several different planes, from the animal to the angelic, and precisely in this lies his danger, that is, of falling to the very lowest. In the Quran it is written, "We propose the burden, that is, responsibility of free will, to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, and they refuse to undertake it. But man took it upon himself, verily he is ignorant. Neither animals nor angels can change their appointed rank and place, but man may sink to the animal or soar to the angel, and this is the meaning of his undertaking that burden of which the Quran speaks." The majority of men choose to remain in the 2 lower stages mentioned above, and the stationary are always hostile to the travellers or pilgrims, whom they far outnumber. Many of the former class, having no fixed convictions about the future world when mastered by their sensual appetites, deny it altogether. They say that hell is merely an invention of theologians to frighten people, and they regard theologians themselves with thinly veiled contempt. To argue with fools of this kind is of very little use. This much, however, may be said to such a man, with the possible result of making him pause and reflect. Do you really think that the 124,001 prophets and saints who believed in the future life were all wrong, and you are right in denying it? If he replies, "Yes, I am as sure as I am that 2 are more than 1, that there is no soul and no future life of joy and penalty," then the case of such a man is hopeless. All one can do is to leave him alone, remembering the words of the Quran, "Though thou call them to instruction, they will not be instructed." But should he say that a future life is possible, but that the doctrine is so involved in doubt and mystery that it is impossible to decide whether it be true or not? Then one may say to him, then you had better give it the benefit of the doubt. Suppose you're about to eat food and someone tells you a serpent has spat venom on it. You would probably refrain and rather endure the pangs of hunger than eat it, though your informant may be in jest or lying. Or suppose you are ill and a charm writer says, give me a rupee and I will write a charm which you can tie around your neck and which will cure you. You would probably give the rupee on the chance of deriving benefit from the charm. Or if an astrologer says, when the moon has entered a certain constellation, drink such and such a medicine and you will recover. Though you may have very little faith in astrology, you very likely would try the experiment on the chance that he might be right. And do you not think that reliance is as well placed on the words of all the prophets, saints and holy men, convinced as they were of a future life, as on the promise of a charm writer or an astrologer? People take perilous voyages in ships for the sake of merely probable profit, and will you not suffer a little pain of abstinence now for the sake of eternal joy hereafter? Hadrat Ali once, in arguing with an unbeliever, said, if you are right, then neither of us will be any the worse in the future. But if we are right, then we shall escape, and you will suffer. This he said, not because he himself was in any doubt, but merely to make an impression on the unbeliever. From all that we have said, it follows that man's chief business in this world is to prepare for the next. Even if he is doubtful about a future existence, reason suggests that he should act as if there were one, considering the tremendous issues at stake. Peace be on those who follow the instruction